Mid-gather shortcut. The mid-gather shortcuts create detailed trim requiring basic skills in zigzag, straight stitch and pivoting. Here is a selection of the mid-gather shortcuts, along with a sample of the trim they create. You'll notice some shortcuts have two styles of mid-gather trim in one shortcut. The mid-gather trim has a seam allowance of 4 mm on either side to allow for a wide or narrow zigzag finish. On each shortcut end is a 20 mm seam allowance for joining fabric and alignment slots to keep the shortcut straight when moving it to trace out along the line of trim. All mid-gather shortcuts are ideally used on the straight grain. However, each shortcut has a bias line if you want to create bias trim. This is the sewing technique for all the mid-gather shortcuts. Prepare a long length of fabric. You may need to join fabric to create longer lengths, depending on the amount of trim required. Start by marking out the mid-gather shortcut. Make sure to mark the outside edges and all inside slots and dots. Be sure to follow and mark out the correct line, as there may be two styles in one shortcut. Cut out both sides of fabric. The second mid-gather example has been used to demonstrate what to do when your mid-gather shortcut has curved edges. Set your machine to sew the outside edges first. The machine setting for the outside edge is zigzag. I set mine to a small zigzag width of 1.5 and increase my bobbin tension slightly so the stitch wraps tightly around the edge. I try to place my needle half on and half off the fabric. This way it coils the fabric underneath as the zigzag stitches down. I also slightly raise the fabric up from the machine bed to manipulate the edge to coil underneath. When sewing on a tightly curved edge, notice the fabric above the curved section is folded into a pleat to keep the fabric edge as straight as possible. Before approaching each tight curved section, slow down, fold the fabric and continue zigzagging to treat it like a straight edge. Setting up the machine for the middle section. Choose a strong thread type as the middle stitching line requires force to gather it up. I use a polyester thread, slightly thicker to avoid breakage. Set the machine to straight stitch and increase the stitch length to 5. Loosen the bobbin tension. I loosen mine to a 4.75. To begin, place the foot into position and don't backstitch. Sew along the marked out middle line. Pivot the needle to create sharp turns and sew through to the end without any breaks in the stitch line. Don't backstitch at the end. Iron off the fabric marker and iron the trim flat. With one hand, take the bobbin thread in between your fingers and draw this out, while, with the other hand, move the gathered fabric along the existing thread line. This takes some finessing to move the fabric into position. Notice, I gently move the gathers down slowly and reposition the fabric. Be gentle. Avoid forcing too much fabric being gathered in one spot along the thread line, as the thread will snap. Aim to evenly distribute the fabric weight. The tighter the gather, the more bulk and drape will result in the final trim appearance. Be sure to only gather the mid-stitch line up to a point that you feel comfortable to stitch on top of. When securing the trim into position on your textile project, be sure to stitch exactly over the mid-gather line stitch. Set the machine top thread and bobbin thread to a normal straight stitch setting and slowly sew over the top. If you have densely gathered trim, use pins to hold the bulk of the fabric in position on either side while you sew through the middle.